Media. Hey, Campside listeners, welcome back to Inside the Tent, our show where we go behind the microphone of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. My name is Lily Houston Smith. I'm a senior producer here at Campside Media. We have just launched a new limited series with CBC, and I'm super excited to tell you all about it. It's called Uncover Allison After NXIVM. Now, NXIVM was an infamous cult. It's probably best known as the cult where a number of women were branded with the initials of its leader, but that's just one disturbing detail among many. It's also well known for attracting very wealthy and famous members, including Allison Mack, who the show is about. Allison got famous for starring in the TV show Smallville, which was huge when I was growing up, and eventually she went to prison for her involvement with NXIVM. A lot of people who were in NXIVM have spoken publicly about their experiences since, but Allison's really one of the last major players who's never spoken to the media. But she did speak to Natalie Robomed, who I'm going to talk to right now. A quick introduction for Natalie. Natalie has a long history with Campside. She's the co-host with Vanessa Grigoriadis of Infamous, and she hosted and wrote Catch Me If You Can. And she is the host and writer of this show, Allison After NXIVM. So we're going to talk today about how the show came about, what it was like spending time with Allison, and all of the sort of destabilizing things that come with immersing yourself in a story like this. If you want any more exclusive content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Natalie, I've worked on this project with you for a number of months, but you have been working on it for so much longer. Can you tell me when you first caught wind of this project?
So this project really came about because of Vanessa Grigoriadis, Campside co-founder and my co-host on Infamous. So Vanessa actually wrote a very crucial story about NXIVM back in 2018 for the New York Times Magazine, where she got unparalleled access. I mean, she went and interviewed Keith Raniere, who's the guy at the head of the cult. She interviewed Claire Bronfman, the Seagram's heiress who funded a lot of NXIVM activities, allegedly put like $100 million into it, estimates say. And she had also critically interviewed Allison back in the day. So after Allison got out of prison and started putting her life back together, she sort of started to be interested in telling her story. And through various means, got in touch with Vanessa. And Vanessa got in touch with me and said, do you want to host this? And I sort of said, no. I was frankly pretty skeptical in the beginning because I just sort of only knew the Allison that everyone else knew, which was really a villain,
Can you explain that briefly? Why is she painted as a villain in the media?
Yeah, so Allison really did, and this part is true, she did play a pivotal role in DOS, which was the women's only so-called sorority in which a lot of the really bad stuff within NXIVM happened. So DOS was a secret kind of subgroup within NXIVM that nobody knew about, and that is where the most extreme stuff in terms of behavior control, in terms of food control, and with brandings was actually going on. So Allison was one of the first 8 members in DOS. But after she was one of the first 8 members, she also became a master in and of herself. So DOS had this slave-master dynamic where Allison was a slave to Keith, who was her master, but then she became a master in her own right and sort of had women who reported up to her. And this is where Allison's kind of criminal activity and worse behavior really happened, She was known as being a very harsh taskmaster, but critically, she was sort of really blamed for sending women to Keith, where some of those women were allegedly sexually assaulted. And so, that wound up in her kind of receiving sex trafficking charges at the end of the day.
So then how did you end up changing your mind and deciding this was a story worth telling?
Well, essentially what happened was, Vanessa called me, said there's this potential project. Allison's interested. And I kind of said, no way. And Vanessa said, just go meet her and like, let me know what you think. And so I went for dinner with Allison. We actually went for dinner in downtown LA at a nice restaurant with Stephen Belber, who's a playwright and a director who had met Allison back in her NXIVM days and kind of was the first person who thought she had a story to tell. And, you know, Allison walked in and I was kind of expecting a very Hollywood sort of actress, very polished, somebody who was really trying to charm me and kind of get her narrative across, maybe, I thought, so that she could like get back into Hollywood and get back to acting. Mm-hmm. But what I found when I met Allison was somebody who was, yes, still beautiful and charming in the ways that a Hollywood star is, but really humbled and very introspective and very interested and willing to look at the bad things she'd done and kind of be accountable for those. And that was very interesting to me because I think it's very rare in our society that people are willing to look at the bad things that they've done and actually be willing to be accountable for them. And also willing to kind of figure out the sticky mess of what do you do after you've hurt somebody? What do you do after you've done wrong? And those were the sorts of questions that Allison's story brought up for me and were why I wanted to do it.
And so you set up an in-person interview with Allison.
Yeah, I mean, after that initial meeting, I mean, it kind of began a process of that tends to happen with very big stories like this, where you kind of are sort of feeling each other out and figuring out how to proceed. And how we eventually did proceed was we did 2 really, really full days of intense, like I'm talking 8-hour interviews down in Long Beach. And I say it was myself and Vanessa Gregoriadis. We were in a hotel room in Long Beach the day after Christmas, which is such strange timing. But it was this sort of, it was that those kind of days between Christmas and New Year that are sort of liminal. You're kind of neither here nor there. You're sort of like bloated from turkey if you celebrate Christmas, but also looking forward to the New Year, but not quite there yet. And so we met Allison on December 26th for these interviews where we were like, this is when we're going to do the bulk of getting her story and really talking to her.
So obviously the subject matter of the podcast is quite dark, and because Allison's experiences are like, they're quite heavy. Can you just talk about like how do you approach asking about these really traumatic episodes in someone's life? Like how do you do it compassionately, but also, like ask hard questions of her?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question and like one that I have thought about a lot while working on this project because, ostensibly I'm getting somebody's life story, and it is both somebody who has been a victimizer, like done really bad things to other people, really hurt other people, but also been a victim. And what I learned from Allison was a history of victimhood from kind of an abusive relationship pre-NXIVM, in which she also got her boyfriend's initial tattooed on her, kind of sort of because she was kind of manipulated into it or pressured into it, right up to sort of, things that also happened in childhood when she was on set because she started acting as a child. And that's not even until we get to NXIVM, where there was a whole host of manipulation, controlling behavior, and sex abuse, honestly. For about a year while Allison was in NXIVM, she says that Keith was having sex with her every day. And she was on a 500 calorie a day diet and sleeping just a few hours every night. And so it's very, very, very intense stuff. And I think like, especially with regards to the sex abuse, the sexual aspects of it, like a lot of that I hadn't been told, or I wasn't aware of exactly how those manipulations had come about. And of course it's incredibly disturbing, incredibly insidious, because it's all from Keith, it's all from this guy's sick perversions, and learning in detail about how he did that and how he pressured and manipulated these women was very disturbing. But As far as how you approach that as a journalist, I've done some reporting on people who have been sexually assaulted and had various traumas before. And I think for me, the main thing is trying to figure out whether this person is in a stable enough place to actually explore this. I think your nightmare as a journalist is to have somebody tell you their story and then them not be in an okay place mentally, And so with Allison, I sort of took some time to kind of really figure out where she was at in her life. And yes, she's very much still working through things, but like she is somewhat stable. She's in therapy, and so had enough distance in the rearview mirror to be able to actually go into this stuff and look at this stuff, because you're right, like it's incredibly upsetting. And like in our interviews, and you can hear it in the podcast, like she's crying, it's very, very emotional stuff. And I have to admit, and it might seem unprofessional too, but like I actually found myself crying during the interviews a couple of times, because it was a lot of what she was telling me was so shocking and so disturbing that I had a really tough time hearing it, Mm-hmm.
And did you believe her? I think this is just as like a side note. I mean, this is something you get into in the podcast, is like one of the big questions that's sort of looming over all of this is that, like, in addition to everything, Allison is also a very good actress. And so it's sort of, it's like a disturbing story, and you feel for her, but then that question also kind of looms.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like this is the catch-22 that actors find themselves in, especially if they're good actors, where anything they do going forth in their life, they're sort of assumed to be a sheep in wolf's clothing and assumed to always be performing. And, of course, part of that is fair, but I do, not to toot my own horn, but I have had a fair amount of experience with like people in Hollywood. I live in LA. I'm around a lot of Hollywood types. And so I think I have a pretty good barometer for understanding when somebody is trying to pull the wool over my eyes, and not to mix metaphors, but I did not feel that that was the case with Allison. Critically, because she admitted to a lot of stuff that wasn't flattering, honestly, but she was admitting to the fact that she's still trying to wrap her head around the bad things that happened and the bad things that she did, and that it's a process. And I actually think that that is much more honest and kind of, in a certain way, commendable.
You didn't just talk to Allison for this podcast. You talked to some of the people around Allison. I guess we can start with Allison's mom. Can you talk about meeting Allison's mom?
Yeah. So, a key part of kind of this story is trying to figure out how somebody who ostensibly had it all wound up in a cult, right? And like with everything, you want to go back to somebody's childhood and kind of talk to the people who know them best. And so a key part of that puzzle for me was Allison's parents. Her dad, unfortunately, has kind of a cognitive decline and wasn't able to speak for the podcast. But her mom was willing to sit with me. She's sort of in her mid-70s at this point. She's very smiley, very sort of bubbly. And I went down and interviewed her at her house in Southern California, just outside of Long Beach. I also spoke to Frank Mink, Allison's husband, who has been speculated upon a bunch by TMZ and the like, who've kind of reported that Allison had married a man named Frank. But now we're revealing his full name, Frank Mink. And one of the things that were most interesting to me was talking and interviewing Frank, Allison's now husband, because he himself, in some ways, has left a cult too. So he was actually a kind of renowned neo-Nazi, which is unbelievable, but true. He was like a key part of the white supremacist movement in kind of the early 90s. I mean, he used to have the word skinhead tattooed on his knuckles. He used to have a flaming, and this is a great thing that you and I fact checked together, a tattoo on his neck that was both a flaming Celtic cross and a flaming swastika. And I think the reason why that's so interesting to me is that, he left the neo-Nazi movement many years ago at this point. And Allison is still quite early in the grand scheme of things in terms of coming out of the NXIVM brainwashing. But Frank is somebody who understands what it's like to be in a high control group where you're thoughts are controlled, your behaviors are controlled. And he understands how hard it is to leave a group like that. And he also fundamentally like really believes in people's ability to change, you know? And that's at the crux of the story is like, can you actually change and move on with your life? Or will those things, the bad things that you've done, be held against you forever?
But of course, you know, some people in NXIVM haven't changed. There are a lot of people who are still in NXIVM. There are a lot of people who are still loyal to Keith. This is something I'd heard, but I don't think I fully realized it until we started trying to reach out to other people. And, you know, there are people, I won't mention names, but like people who are, you know, sending us details about how the court case was rigged and all of these things, who just believe that Keith is totally innocent. And so we had a lot of trouble finding other people from NXIVM to talk to. But you did eventually find someone. Can you talk about that other person who you found?
Yeah. So I don't think I've actually ever told the story of how this came to be, but I wound up speaking to Lauren Salzman. Now, for those who don't know the NXIVM story, Lauren Salzman's mother, Nancy Salzman, is prefect. She was the second in command of NXIVM. She is the person who built NXIVM with Keith Raniere. Lauren was her daughter and essentially was almost, I don't know, pretty much born into NXIVM kind of thing. And so for the very first time, she talked to me about how she wound up being in NXIVM, which was essentially like she graduated college and her mom was working on this thing with Keith. And she said, you know, I was in NXIVM before NXIVM was even a thing. And I think she wound up spending 2 decades of her life in NXIVM. And so Lauren Salzman, a lot of people have tried to talk to Lauren over the years. She is a pivotal part of the NXIVM story because she was very high up in the organization. Like NXIVM, there was the outer kind of like public facing stuff, which was the sort of courses and the business that they kind of had. And then there was the secret DOS stuff, like the secret sex stuff that was going on. And so Lauren was very much a big part of the outer public facing things. And she was kind of really seen almost as second in command to some of the younger members. She actually ended up testifying against Keith. So she was indicted, you know, charged, like she faced charges just like Allison and Keith and her mom and another woman who was NXIVM's bookkeeper and Claire Bronfman.
But she never went to prison.
Claire flipped. Claire flipped and testified against Keith and was, you know, really fundamental in the government's case and kind of helping put Keith behind bars.
Yeah.
So, you know, Lauren, I had been obviously wanting to talk to her, but kind of thought this is impossible. I don't even know where she is. I don't, you know, I'm sure she's going to say no. And my husband, who is a comedian and an actor, actually knows somebody who went to high school with Lauren. And so I know it's always
this is journalism at work. This is
journalism at work. And so he was talking to this guy about, you know, I actually don't even know how it came up, but he mentioned that I was working on this project. And the guy kind of said, you know, I know Lauren Salzman. And so then I talked to my husband's friend and kind of really explained what the project was. And he had Lauren Salzman's cell phone number. And because I sort of came vouched for by this other guy who she went to high school with, she was willing to hear me out. And so we had a couple introductory conversations. And of course, she was very nervous. And, you know, I should say Lauren Salzman and Allison, they legally aren't allowed to be in touch. So they can't communicate. This was just me speaking to Lauren on her own. And she's been through some things, you know, and she also, of course, did some really bad things in NXIVM as well that she was on criminal charges for. Namely, she kind of played a role in helping ensure that this one woman was kind of detained in one room for 2 years, which is just horrifying. But I was able to get Lauren on the phone and get her to talk about NXIVM and critically talk about the moment when Keith was arrested down in Mexico. Because Lauren was sort of in the room with him when the Mexican police came storming into the house and banging on the door for her to open it up and let them in so they could take Keith. And having that part of the story was fascinating because I think we had no idea how that really went down. And then to get her firsthand account was very powerful.
So, okay, another key scene that comes up in the podcast is that you accompany Allison to get the brand that she had done when she was in DOS covered. So can you tell me just about what happened and what that was like?
Yeah. She mentioned not long after we first met that she was going to get her brand covered with a tattoo. And the tattoo that she was planning to get was a lotus flower, which in many cultures symbolizes rebirth and kind of reincarnation and redemption. And so for Allison, this was a key part of her healing journey, you know, to kind of no longer have this searing welt on her skin that signified her devotion to Keith and signified the more than a decade that she spent in this cult, but also signified the pain she'd caused other people by leading them to get branded. And so when I heard that she was going to get it covered up with a tattoo, I sort of said, I have to be there. I mean, what a brilliant scene for the podcast. I just knew that it was powerful, you know, just so symbolic, you know. So she agreed to let me come with her. And so it was kind of a hot summer day. I went with her to a tattoo shop on the east side of LA, like not very far from where I live. And she showed me her brand, you know. And it really just looked kind of like an angry scar, you know, sort of right by the hip bone. Definitely faded over the years, but still angry and still present. I mean, I didn't immediately see Keith's initials. I knew to look for them, of course, but it just looked like more like this like kind of bizarre symbol. And so I stayed with her for probably about an hour. We just started talking about therapy and various things and what it all meant to her. And she wound up getting this pink flower with sort of a pink lotus flower, this yellow center. And she texted me a picture of it after it was done. I mean, I ended up leaving after an hour because I sort of felt like this is a big thing and like you should be alone for it sort of thing. Like I've gotten what I needed. I don't need to be here for all 3 hours of the tattoo appointment as well. But yeah, she sent me this picture of it and it just it's very powerful. I mean, it's what she's trying to do with her life. She's trying to move on and she's trying to metabolize and alchemize this great pain that she has both experienced and done onto others into something hopeful, something that's kind of like a flower, like reaching upwards towards the light.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and to the whole team that helped make this show. And thank you, listeners, for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.